So top 10 tree traumas. The reason I title this presentation with that title is because we often are well-meaning to care for our trees, but definitely some common oopsies happen along the way. And we'll just cover some of those, and you don't have to raise your hand or make a note in the chat if you've done any of these things. But hopefully with a little information, they won't happen, and you can help others learn to prevent these as well. So we'll just go ahead and jump in, and we're going to start with a little quiz about Maryland. And the quiz is, do you know how many acres we have in Maryland and how many people live here? And surprisingly, it's 6 million acres for 6 million people. Oh, I'm sorry. Somehow we got animation started here. So it's a pretty small state for a lot of people. And one other thing, hang on, I apologize.
No worries.
Yeah, I think I added a slide and that somehow added animations. So pretty small state with a lot of people on it. So, but each person affects trees on a daily basis in any number of ways. And what we're going to focus on today is when we actually do care of trees. And to start that, I guess just 2 basic slides on what do we mean about trees and tree needs and how these top 10 traumas can occur. So trees, of course, have 4 main parts: the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. And probably as we go through this, we'll cover some things that happen to each component of the tree. And when a tree grows, it has some basic needs as well. Again, that with these different aspects of tree care that we're going to talk about can be impacted by the different trees' individual needs. So of course they need light, right? Sunlight. And they also need air, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And they need any variety of nutrients. They need water. And then they need this 5th element that is often forgot about, that of course starts to indicate some of the oopsies that happen with trees, and that is space. People definitely forget that small trees get bigger. So let's start with number 1. And I'm going to start with planting because that's the beginning of a tree's life, right? When we get our small tree and we put it in the ground. So there's lots of planting predicaments that can occur as one of these top 10 tree traumas. And my biggest one is too low won't grow. I cannot tell you how many projects I've been involved in where I either go after the fact and these trees look beautifully planted and cared for, and I start digging in the soil and the mulch, and invariably these trees are too low in the ground. Ideally, we want the root flare or the widest part at the bottom of the trunk to be level with the soil surface or slightly higher. This is a tree, and I'm going to name names as we go through this, so hopefully nobody takes offense as to where I took these photographs. But this is at the Thurmont Library, and Thurmont is an extremely passionate and strong partner in tree planting and care efforts. And this tree just maybe got put in the ground before all that started to occur, and they grew their knowledge. So this tree is actually like 7 inches too deep in the soil. This one was actually planted in the city of Cumberland just about a month ago, and it's a beautiful bald cypress tree. And they paid like probably $200 for this tree. So there was definitely intent to have this beautiful specimen live for a long time. And they put it in not so great soils. And when I started again digging around, you can see it was 3 to 4 inches too deep in this somewhat anaerobic soil. So a lot of money, a lot of effort to get the tree there, put it in the ground, a lot of intention to have it live for a long time. But this is enough that this tree will not survive. All right, so here's the rule of thumb, right? You put a $10 tree in a $100 hole and not vice versa. If you put a small tree in a hole that's properly dug and prepared, that tree will catch up to your $100 tree in your $10 hole and live a much longer and healthier life. Here's actually a properly designed hole. This is a boot of one of our Maryland Forest Service employees. And the tree is at grade with the grass. It's wide enough that they can get their boot in there and their hands in there to work the soil around the tree root ball. And it allows for fluffing up of the soil and a little bit of aeration so that those young tree roots have a good opportunity to establish. Okay, so the other thing in tree planting, so our planting predicaments that we end up getting accidentally involved in are hardiness zones. And you guys are involved in trees, so I imagine you have this good understanding of the fact that certain plants grow in certain regions of the country based on the lowest potential winter temperature. And you also, I'm sure, are pretty knowledgeable of the fact that this is changing actually pretty quickly. So trees that you might have planted in where I live, which is Garrett County, which is right here, was in zone 6 of your hardiness zones. So this is a 2006 hardiness zone map. If you grab the 2015 hardiness zone map, that same area where you would have been in hardiness zone 6 is already hardiness zone 7. That's a 10-degree difference in the coldest possible temperature in winter. So this, you may plant a tree species that's no longer suited for that area, so it won't do well. And this is just something that would easily occur without people having this knowledge, because they're going to plant what they've always planted before, but that may not grow there anymore. Something else to be aware of. Some other traumas that can happen during the tree planting process is the type of stock that you buy. People they go to a nursery and they assume if they buy a tree at the nursery, it's going to be a good tree. And hopefully that should be the case, but it isn't. Unfortunately, it isn't. What you need to do to prevent some traumas for this tree down the road is really take a good look at that plant before you actually pay for it. If you're looking at different sized trees to plant and you decide on a large bald and burlap tree, you need to be aware that that tree is going to only come with about 5% of the roots that it had when it was growing out in the field. You need to look at the root collar, that part that gets wider at the bottom of the tree that we just talked about, and make sure that there are no cuts or maybe a twist tie around there that's going to be girdling the tree. If there's a plastic sleeve, if you might buy a tree at Lowe's, lift that sleeve away and make sure there's no wounds underneath of it, or any fungi, or heaven forbid, even some insects. So another way to nip those tree traumas in the bud is to just spend a little time with your plant stock before you buy it and take it home. Okay, another thing that can really impact the start of a tree's life are soil types and conditions. I talked about that poor bald cypress that was put in some waterlogged soils. Even though it's a bald cypress, it was a little challenging for its first couple days in the ground. And then you have to look at growing constraints, right? So we're gonna, when we plant a tree, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look up to the sky, down to the ground, and actually spin yourself around in the place that you're going to be planting your tree. Are there any constraints for when this little guy starts getting bigger that are going to cause some trauma down the road? And, you know, it's nice to plant a tree. Susan said I'm from Allegheny County, and that's the driest county in the state. If you're going to commit to planting a tree that's going to be around for decades, do you have the opportunity to water it if it need be, if it has that need? And what are any past, current, and future uses of the site? We want these guys to have the best possible start. All right, who's ever pulled a tree out of a pot and seen this? Yep, some people are shaking their heads, I see. And this is called what we like to call Medusa hair. If anybody knows the reference there to the story about Medusa and the snakes in her hair. So if you encounter this when you pull your plant out of the pot, then you need to interrupt those encircling roots. Otherwise, this poor little guy is going to strangle itself as it starts to grow. So again, another planting predicament that these guys are put in is people not paying attention to this when they put them in the ground. It's a really small thing that you can do that's going to have super lasting impact for that tree's vigor in the future. All right, so those are some of the things that you can encounter with those planting predicaments. That's my trauma number one. And I know that encompassed a few other factors, but that's the most critical part, is getting your young tree started. So who has not seen this? I don't dare say I would see anybody on the screen admitting to never having seen this, or perhaps even having done it themselves. Mulch mountains are an attempt to overly love your tree. This particular one was a larger maple tree, probably a 12-inch maple tree, and it had 12 inches of mulch against its trunk. Clearly, you can't see that nice root flare at the soil line because it's buried under all this mulch. And this can be really traumatic for trees for a number of reasons. One, it can trap moisture against the trunk. It can be a home for mice and voles that will impact the tree's root systems. It can actually cause the root systems to grow up into the mulch. That's such a nice, warm, moist environment. So definitely this is a trauma that I wish I could just go around everywhere I travel and just pull all this back, no matter where. Maybe if I were in my Maryland Forest Service uniform, people wouldn't think I was so crazy, but this is such a simple thing. And landscape companies are guilty of doing this. Homeowners are guilty of doing this. And it's just a lack of knowing. You know, really, people know that mulch helps trees, so their intent is to do that. This is a Taco Bell in Hagerstown, so try to make some Washington County references here. And again, mulch mountain, and not only a mulch mountain, but they use this red dyed mulch. And it's probably better than it used to be, but we don't need to color our mulch. And this adds a chemical to the mix that's not necessary. And it also can hide a number of sins, that this mulch could be ground up pallets or other waste wood that wouldn't necessarily be good for your tree. So definitely mulch mountains we need to make sure they happen less and less and less and less on the landscape. All right, how about those cheap chips, right? Utility companies, they're constantly taking down trees or pruning trees, and they're looking for places to dump the chips because they have limited access to dump sites. So again, I'm going to call everybody out in my photographs. This is one of our own state parks, and they receive these chips because they have a nice large parking lot for the utilities to dump them. And they do actually let them age for a year before they're used. This is important because green wood, which the utilities are usually cutting live wood, so it's still green, needs to start in the decomposition process. It uses nitrogen. So if we were to put these green chips around our plants, it's going to pull out that vital nutrient that the plant needs. And actually you might see some chlorotic or yellowing in the leaves around your tree. So we definitely, the price is right on these cheap chips, but we definitely need to let them sit for a little bit. All right, number 3, mower madness. Again, going to call out one of our state parks because we have a lot of contractual seasonals that come in the summer. And unless they're properly trained to watch their string trimmers, they can easily cut into a tree trunk at the base. So then it's what's called a basal wound. That's always going to be with that tree. A tree, when it gets wounded, it seals it off. It does not heal from it. So that wound will always be there to some degree. And if it's at the base of the tree, the result could be down the road when it's a little bit bigger, that could cause whole tree failure. So look at this figure on the estimated acres of lawn cut each year in the US. It's a little astounding, 40 to 50 million acres. Lawnmowers are just as guilty of nicking the bark as weed whackers. And so if we start mowing less, then the amount of wounding of trees should also go down. Let's see if we can play this video for you. See if it'll load. This is from Friends of Trees, and I'm gonna stop speaking for just about a minute and a half and let you watch this video.
Hey, Becky, can you press hide on that little pop-up window?
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Thank you.
All right, so it took us 60 seconds to watch that video. And that tree is now permanently damaged and may actually fail pretty quickly. Because if the biology of a tree is the mechanisms to move water and nutrients are just under the bark. So it really doesn't take a deep wound to cause permanent damage to a tree. So, you know, one of the things that we at DNR can do better with our staff is to train them how to use those mower guards and turn their weed whacker away from the tree if they need to trim close to it. So number 4 is staking strangles. If you've ever planted a tree with me, and Susan just had that opportunity to do that recently, one thing I always say is, unless it is absolutely necessary not to stake trees. When you add stakes, you're usually also adding some sort of support system, either a garden hose and wire, or even some webbing or plastic chain. And this can easily cut into a young tree that is growing vigorously, and then also cause whole tree failure down the road. So I always say not to stake unless you're in a really high wind area or perhaps a high vandalism area. So I don't know if you guys can see in this photograph, but the top of this young tree is wider than the bottom. And what we know about trees, right, is that they're supposed to taper the other way. They're supposed to be fatter at the bottom and get skinnier as you go up. That's because this rabbit guard had constricted that tree so much that it couldn't expand underneath that plastic. And then of course there's these, right? The garden hose and the stake. There's not even a wire anymore that goes from this hose back to the stake. So it's not even really serving a function. The only thing this has served to do is to kill that tree. I have a lot of photographs of this. I could probably have done, you know, a whole presentation just on this issue. The intent to care is there. This is in front of a historic home in Cumberland. And they put this decorative wire cage around this young, it is a Bradford pear, nonetheless, to protect it from the doors, car doors hitting against the trunk, which was wonderful. But again, you came around the back of the tree and there's this old garden hose that has grown into the trunk. So again, the intent is typically there, but people tend to not go back and take those off. Here's a challenge to Aqua. I'm going to throw this out there. So I always wanted to start a program called Free a Tree. So if you guys have the robust volunteer passion that I know you do, one of the things that I've always wanted to do is partner with different agencies and just have a day every fall perhaps where you just go around your community and you free trees that have these tags and webbing and garden hoses still wrapped around them. Imagine the impact that could be made if just something this simple could be done. So this is Rocky Gap State Park for those that have visited there before. And they recently had a whole bunch of young trees planted. Well, it was last summer, early summer. So I was inspecting these trees for survival. They were planted by a professional landscape company. And this is what I found. I found all of these tags still on these beautiful young yellow wood. And the picture in the lower left is the pile of flagging and tags that I took off just a few trees that I walked around and pulled them off of. So there's my challenge to Aqua, Free a Tree program. Here's another one in our state park. At least this one was loose enough that it slid down the tree and hasn't actually girdled the tree yet. All right, so that a little more time on that one because that one really bothers me. The next one, number 5, is compaction kills. And compaction is, we think about something like this, right? That you're excavating, that you're using dump trucks or heavy equipment. And actually, you know, of course, this is an example of tree compaction, but it can be much more subtle and still have just as devastating an impact. So changing the grade within a critical root zone of a tree by as little as 3 inches. That's half the width, half the size of a dollar bill. Little as 3 inches will adversely affect a tree. You know, it gets rid of the airspace in the soil, and it allows less space for water to be in the root zone that the tree's going to need. So your ideal soil for a tree is 50% airspace, 50% soil solids. So if you put this backhoe on top of that soil, you're going to start compressing that 50% airspace and cause harm to these trees. These poor hemlocks have to survive hemlock woolly adelgid. They don't need any other challenges coming at them. So one way to address this tree trauma is just plan in advance. There's lots of ways you can protect trees if you're going to have to use heavy equipment around them. The most critical thing to do and keep in mind is to stay out of that critical root zone. And that's 1.5 feet radius for every 1 inch diameter of the tree. So if you have a 10-inch tree, try to stay 15 feet away from the trunk with any sort of adverse impact. And if you need to go in that zone, put a really thick layer of mulch to try to absorb some of it. Here's what happens when we have compaction. And this compaction, as you can see, this is a beautiful old red oak in Garrett County. And somebody built a vacation home next to Deep Creek Lake, and they put in this driveway. You can see the newly paved driveway. just to the left of the tree. So I took this photograph right after the driveway was put in, and then I took the photograph on the right 5 years after the new driveway had been put in. So this seems like one of those highlight magazines where you have to compare two photos and see what's different. I don't know if you guys can see the detail. I'll try to point it out to you here. So here's the original tree. What's not in this photograph on the left, that's in this photograph on the right, are these stone walls that they put in with a little lamp to light the entrance of the driveway. Well, they had to dig down 4 feet to put the base for these stone walls. And are they within the critical root zone of that big old red oak? Absolutely. So definitely some impact, and that's partly what's causing this dieback. If you see the top of a tree dying like this, the first place you need to look for the tree trauma is down at the roots. More than likely, it's not something going on in the top part of the tree. It's almost always something with the root zone. And then here's their little weeping cherry. I don't know if you can also see that. That's the tree that's still there today. The red oak is of course gone. Here's another example, and I have lots of these as well. This is an historic elm tree at Garrett Memorial Hospital, and they built this doctor's office again within the critical root zone of that tree, and this is what is left of it today. So top 10 tree trauma, watch that critical root zone and plan ahead for impact. It didn't have to happen to be able to build the office of a healer. It does sometimes boggle my mind that people that are involved in health are unaware of some of the health benefits of nature, and it was right outside their door. At least for now, there's still part of it left. I talked about compaction can be something small, not like a big bulldozer in the root zone of the trees, but something as small as putting this, the city of Frostburg was fixing this street, and these are the road cobbles. They carefully put the road cobbles out of the way because they wanted to reuse them, but they nicked the bark on this young pin oak, and then they put all this weight around in the soil zone underneath this tree. So again, it doesn't have to be big to have long-term adverse trauma to the tree. Is this something that could easily have been avoided just by moving these bricks 3 feet down the road? So that's some of the heartbreak there too. Just being aware so these things don't happen in the future. And here's one I know nobody in Aqua has to deal with, right? Fertilizer fire. A lot of people fertilize their lawns, and fertilizers are salt, and salts draw water or can draw water away from our trees and cause some burn on the leaves. So depending on how they're applied, what's applied, when they're applied, fertilizers can definitely be a fire impact of the root zones of our young trees and our older trees, but mostly our young trees. All right, number 7, lucky number 7 is pesky pest. So my suggestion to avoid this tree trauma is to constantly monitor your trees. Look for any changes in color and form or anything that looks weird. I mean, the best way to know what looks weird is to know what a healthy version of that plant looks like. So in this case, this is hemlock woolly adelgid, little white puffballs on the hemlock leaves. Pretty noticeable, but not all these pesky pests are so obvious. So definitely monitor your trees regularly to avoid this trauma. And there's this guy. I had to throw him in last minute because he's starting to emerge. Are you guys seeing him down in Washington? Nobody's shaking their head. Yes. They are, pardon? They are being seen. This photograph, this is a current photograph of, looks like a silver maple. in Clarksville, and the cicada are all over that tree. So a couple of things about cicada. People were worried about the ovipositing in young trees on the twigs. There is some damage, but unless you have some ornamental or highly valued fruit trees, probably not too much to worry about. But I wanted to point out that, again, since Aqua, our robust volunteer group, there is an app called the Cicada Safari. And if you start seeing cicada, you can upload photographs with their location, and you can help citizen science for the next brood that comes in another 17 years. So that might be kind of fun to do. And then also the University of Maryland is looking for, the University of Maryland Extension is looking for information about cicada on their website, and they have cicada merch. So sometimes, you know, you can, little bit of tree trauma, there's going to be some damage on some young twigs, but this is quite the scientific phenomenon. So it is a pesky pest, but not one that will kill trees. And some of those pesky pests are not always insects, but they can also be birds, they can be mammals, damaged trees, and then you have these guys, your fungi. If you ever see something bright orange and robust in the fungi world at the base of a tree, you better start looking a little deeper, because these guys can cause some serious harm. They show up if the tree has some defect on the inside. This is a butt rot fungi. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's gorgeous. But that means that this large diameter oak probably has a very significant hollow in it and may be subject to whole tree failure. And that can be pretty serious. So keep an eye out for all these pesky pests just by monitoring your trees. You guys like to spend time amongst the trees, so I know that's not a hardship by any means. All right, number 8, we're getting to the end here to wrap up our top 10. There are a lot of these pruning oopsies that happen. I see all over the place. And this one, again, it's with all good intent to love the tree. We don't suggest using this black tree tar anymore. This was a big wound. This branch got taken off by a truck passing by. This is a street tree. And so it was not proper pruning by any means, but someone tried to help this tree. We do not suggest using this anymore. All right, this is what's called a flush cut. And this is where you cut into the tissue that actually helps the tree seal off the wound. The tree will never be able to seal off the wound now, and then somebody defaced this poor tree. So this is an improper pruning cut. When you do that, when you cut into the tissue that helps the tree seal over that. All right, so given that information, just a real quick primer on how to prune a tree. Pruning cuts should be made close to the trunk or the parent limb, and you don't want to cut into this raised branch collar. That's what they did in the previous photograph, because in there is tissue that will divide and actually try to seal off that opening, which you want to happen so insects and disease can't get into the tree trunk. So this is definitely where you want to make your cut, especially on a small branch. All right. If you have a larger, always use, of course, the proper tool. Who has ever tried to saw with their hand pruners, right? Everybody, if you've done it before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You put the pruners that are too small for the branch around that branch, and you wiggle it back and forth and try to use it like a saw. So one thing you can do that's pretty simple to reduce trauma to these trees is just use the proper tool for the job. And if you have to cut a larger limb, we like you to use this 3-cut method. And it's actually pretty simple to do. You make your first cut about 3 inches away from that branch collar on the underside of the branch. Then when you make your second cut out here, you're getting rid of all the weight that might be in that branch through leaves. That'll go out of your way, and then you only have this tiny little stub to cut, which you can easily hold in your hand while you make the proper cut outside the branch collar. This is so important, really. I can't stress enough that if you like to do home pruning, you do not want to disturb this branch collar. Easy to do when you're aware to look for it. All right, number 9, stop stubbing. So the 3-cut method that I just told you, if you stopped with cut 1 and 2 and didn't complete cut 3, this is what you would get. You would get these stubs. If you leave a stub, the tree cannot seal off that pruning wound. So you might as well have essentially either not cut the branch in the first place, or you can go back and correct this after the fact. So again, don't leave these stubs, and it can be as small as ½ an inch if to keep that tree from sealing off that wound.
Becky, I have some Norway spruce that are under stress, and we have a lot of dead lower branches. So you're saying I should cut all those off?
Yes, so that if your lower branches are already failed and no needles, you should cut those off at the trunk. And there should be a slightly raised area that you can see, not to cut into that, but don't leave a stub. Yeah, if the needles have already failed off those lower branches, they're not going to recover. So unless you want to leave them for like bird cover, or the dead branches for animal cover or bird resting perch or something like that.
Yeah.
All right, and here's number 10. Oh, this just makes me sigh heavily. Topping is terminal for a tree. And people look at a tree like this one on the left that's been completely topped, and they see all of these water sprouts start to grow back, and to them the tree looks more robust than ever. But this is just the tree trying to make some sort of leaf to make food to survive. So topping is always sort of it can be a quick death or it can be a slow death. This silver maple right here was severely topped, but probably like 15 years ago, and it's still able to produce enough leaves to sort of eke along. And then of course this hemlock on the right, it was definitely done for. That was a whole tree topping right there. So that's wrap that one up as number 10 as being one that's pretty pervasive on the landscape. And not to point fingers, but I see a lot of it in Washington County. so I don't know what's going on down there in the ag community, or the ag culture down there. Perhaps has something to do with that. I don't know, but yeah, topping is terminal. And any good arborist, one thing I didn't have in my bio was any good arborist, and I've been a certified arborist for 20 some years, would always give you a bonus, number 11. So one of the things that can be a trauma to us if trees are in poor health is that hazards hurt. When you're monitoring your trees for just how healthy they are, or looking for insects and disease, look for decay and defects as well. If there's something wrong with your tree and it has the potential to hurt something if it were to fail, either you or your house or a car or a sidewalk, then that is definitely considered a hazardous tree. You might look for things like these really tight branch angles, and then you start to see this split begin down the tree. That can be something you would easily miss or walk by, but definitely can cause part of the tree to fail. There's lots of examples of what a hazard tree can be. This is a dead hemlock right over a propane tank, and this is a DNR property. So, and this one, I'll wrap it up with this one. This one was a large white pine in Oakland that I was actually measuring for a big tree champion. And it was kind of a windy day that day. This tree's like 120 feet tall. And as I was measuring it and the tree was swaying, this crack was opening and closing. So, this is definitely a hazard that could hurt for sure. It was a pretty large diameter tree. So for this trauma, my recommendation is just keep an eye on your trees. Again, if it doesn't seem right, it probably isn't, and to call for some expert help. Just a reminder from earlier, when you're dealing with trees, always remember to look up, down, and all around. I'll end with this final thought. If we address all of these tree traumas in our urban spaces, maybe people will start to become more comfortable with creating wild spaces in their urban places. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Becky.
Sure, my pleasure.
I'm sure folks have questions. I know I have one. While you're thinking of them, you can, we're such a small group. You can, turn off your mic if you want to ask Becky directly, or you can just put it in the chat. But I'll start out because we had, I'm gonna stop your screen there. There we go. In the Sunday paper in Washington County, the Herald Mail usually has a home section that provides advice on how to, do this, that, or the other. And there's usually some lawn care type thing in there. And maybe a week or two ago, my husband showed me this painting your trees. And it was encouraging people to paint like 6 feet up around the entire tree. And I had never heard of this. And I wanted to see what you thought about that. To me, that sounds like a tree trauma to me, but they were citing these benefits.
Yeah, that, of course, we don't recommend that. One thing that can be a cultural practice. I remember a visit to Puerto Rico, and it was very common for all of the trees to be painted down there for that bottom 6 feet, as you said. Some people think that it reflects the sun, so it prevents sun scald, which on young trees can cause bark splits and some other tree traumas. But we do not recommend it. But so I think it's more of a cultural practice and for that sun scald issue. So.
Becky, I had a question about, you mentioned about not staking trees except in high wind situations. Well, I happen to live in an extremely high wind area off a cornfield near the airport,
That would do it.
So there's lots of trees in our neighborhood that are actually kind of at a 45-degree angle because they haven't been staked. So we're trying really hard to not have that happen. So we are staking our trees, and we have some trees in tubes. What would be something I would look for to know before any damage is done, or to recommend when we should remove those, or when it's safe and the tree has been established and its roots are strong enough to withstand that wind?
Okay, I have a couple of things there, Kim.
Okay.
One, if it sounds like, obviously, if your trees are leaning at a 45-degree angle, there's
my trees are not. All of the neighborhood trees are.
Okay.
So you can tell that from the wind is really pushing the trees over. So we're like, we want to avoid that.
So staking does sound warranted in that case, and I would do it on the windwards or leeward side. So your prevailing wind should be the northwest. If your trees are leaning toward the southeast,
Yep.
To go ahead and put one single stake on the leeward side, or try to convince your neighbors to do that. And you can stake if you saw in the one picture with the yellowwood trees where they used webbing and they tied it more loosely around the tree. What you look for when you know to remove it is if the tree looks discolored or wet underneath the staking area. If you see some of that swelling that I showed you in the one picture where the tree looks abnormally fat where it shouldn't, that means fluids are collecting underneath the bark. So I would say, and then if it's actually cutting into the tree, if that starts to cut into the tree, you can still remove it carefully, and the tree may be vigorous enough to close over that gap where the tie was. So the best thing to look for is just scooch that tie out of the way and see if it looks wet or mossy or green underneath.
Okay, and how long would you say is long enough to get those? I mean, we're buying, you know, as large a tree as we can find, but you know, they're still baby trees. How long could I keep those staked, or would you recommend?
Generally, if they're planted correctly, the stakes can be removed after a full growing season.
Okay.
Only one.
Yep. Okay.
So
That's what-
if they're large.
Thank
If
you.
they're larger trees and you can monitor the staking, you can probably leave it on for another year or two longer. But generally, we recommend they come off 1 year after planting.
Okay.
Because if they're vigorously growing, they should be able to establish a root system to hold themselves up.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Becky, around my property, I have cut into some of the roots that are sticking above ground for some of the trees around my property.
Yep.
Do I need to do anything to those roots, or should I get some dirt and cover them up?
Okay. Yep. Yeah. That's another way lawnmower damage occurs. Of course, is surface roots. I'm gonna pause here for a second. I'm in a room where I'm starting my vegetable plants, and it's like being in a greenhouse. Very warm in here. So if you have surface roots from lawnmower damage, something to keep in mind is a tree's root system is half of its biomass. So if you pulled the tree out of the ground, you shook all the soil off, and you put that sucker on a scale, half its weight would be underground. So if you're damaging some of the surface roots, as long as they aren't a structural root, the big fat ones right next to the trunk, you can probably cut them cleanly with a pair of pruners or a small saw and just remove those roots rather than cover them up, because they're a living root. And if you cover them up and it's an exposed wound that hasn't healed, you might be creating an environment for fungi to get in that root system. So if you make a nice clean cut, the tree can respond to that by initiating new growth at the point of that cut. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
So you can definitely pull them up, take your loppers or your pruners, trim those out, and you should be fine. There's a whole lot more root system underneath there that you aren't seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Can you speak more about the bark splits and what causes those
Sure.
beyond, say, the deer rubbing their antlers?
Right. Well, right. So that's buck rub. That's a little different than the bark split situation. So oftentimes bark split can happen for, let's just say, these top 3 reasons. A young tree, especially if it has thin bark, like a red maple, and that's one of our most ubiquitous species on the landscape. So nobody's planting those in Hagerstown, right, Susan? Young trees with thin bark like that, if they start to run their sap in the spring, and then we get a cold snap, the sap can actually freeze and can cause bark split. So that's one way it can happen. Another way that it can happen is the tree is growing so vigorously, it's growing faster than bark formation. So you can get splits that way. And then another way that bark splits can happen is you get sun scald on a portion of the bark of the tree due to, especially if it's planted in a really sunny space and we have some pretty intense sunlight that that tree may or may not be used to, then that can cause bark splits as well. So those are some of the common reasons that I see, especially on those thinner bark species where you see that splitting occur. Do you have it on your trees? Is that why? Have you seen it?
Yes, one of them.
Yeah.
Pretty bad too.
Is it a smaller tree?
It's sort of medium, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I bet it's a thinner bark also. I mean, definitely the ones, you don't tend to see it on older trees because their growth is slower and they have more established bark. But generally in those younger trees, you see that.
We had one strange thing that I kind of threw at Bob Schwartz earlier this year. We had an explosion of red cedar saplings growing in our yard, and we couldn't decide where they were coming from. We still haven't really figured it out. I thought maybe our Christmas wreath that we had put in the compost pile, maybe the pine cones bore babies or something like that. But we obviously didn't want to use anything herbicide-ish on it. So we pulled them out painstakingly by hands. I probably pulled 400 red cedar saplings. Is there any way that you can think of that something like that would have happened? We've only been in our home for 4 years, so it was an old cornfield before, but this was quite the undertaking. And, I would say the saplings were probably just above the grass, maybe an inch tall, and they were everywhere.
Yeah, that's when you call on your aqua friends to come.
Right. Please come help me pull baby pine trees.
Yeah. Well, clearly red cedar loves Washington County. And I'd have to look this up for you. But I would look up how persistent red cedar seed is in the soil.
Okay.
And it could be that you had red cedar seed in your soil that was just waiting for the opportunity to sprout.
Right.
That's one possibility I can think of. I know some tree species like poplar can seed many seeds, and that they can languish in the soil for 7, 8, even 10 years. And given the right opportunity and the light and moisture, they can create a forest. Boom, just like that. So
Right. I mean, I think by now we would have had, as fast as they were growing, we would have had like knee-high red cedars after it just they sprung up overnight. So
right, and they like disturbed sites like old pasture sites and
yeah.
some of those limestone fields that get abandoned or reverted from ag use.
Exactly. We just wanted to make sure it wasn't something that we were doing. So I pestered everyone I could think of, like, how do I get rid of these things? And everybody said, you have to pull them. So
Well, and who knows, you might be doing that for a while. What was Bob's theory?
he didn't have a theory on how it happened. I mean, old cornfield, he just thought that, they were probably just waiting to sprout as you had. But he didn't have a better solution than just good old fashioned elbow grease and pulling them out. So
Yeah, free tree giveaway.
yeah, I have you all for red cedars for here on out. So thank you.
Oh, sure.
Oh, Becky, speaking of those freebies, those volunteers that Kim's talking about, the I guess it's the white ash that is dying back, right?
All ash.
So I'm using my plant app here to identify plants, and so I'm finding baby green ash and white ash.
Excellent.
At least that's what they identify as.
Yep.
Hard for me to tell them apart. The same as apparently American elm is still coming up on its own.
Yes.
So it seems that if we have volunteers coming up, we should try to propagate them. If they're in a good place, I just let them grow where they are,
Right.
or move them where it's better. But that kind of makes sense, is that we want to continue to grow them because eventually they might be able to find a way to overcome those diseases,
That's right.
and they're natives. So, right, we would continue to grow them, right?
Right. So our nursery, state nursery right now is not selling green ash till we figure out what's going on here. But they're a great tree if you have the resources in your yard to monitor for emerald ash borer and treat for emerald ash borer. I mean, there's definitely that happening out there where trees are being saved for future seed bank possibilities and to create another viable
Right.
population of these species. So that, I know Hagerstown, Susan and I were just on a call with Hagerstown. They're looking at ways to offer free trees to citizens in the city of Hagerstown. Not necessarily the ash would be that tree for that audience, but it reminds me that it might be a nice partnership with Aqua, if you guys are interested in propagating some of these native species, even if they're just little, for giveaways on like Arbor Days and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So next time, Kim, give me a call when you have those volunteers. I love volunteers because they're native and they come up with the Eastern Red Cedar is sold by the state nursery.
Yes.
It's funny. I
So
have
they
an
are,
amazing story of a volunteer. I had a red bud that I planted from backyard buffers. It's still about yay tall. At the same time, I had a volunteer red bud. That one is like 14 feet tall in the same amount of time. So like the volunteers, for whatever reason, have a better shot. So
they're not grown in captivity, for one thing. I mean, with all the traumas that Becky's talking about, they weren't forced into a pot.
Right.
And transplanted and added mulch and all that stuff until by the time you get them, that tree's been pretty well worked over. The dogwoods we ordered from, what was it, Clear Ridge Forest or whatever it was. It says on the package that they were actually grown in Oregon. I was shocked.
Yeah.
But natives are, the dogwoods are native here as well. But so you don't know where your trees are coming from. It was just, I think, unusual that it still had a label on them. It was grown in Oregon.
Yeah.
But yeah, the volunteers seem to me the way to propagate everything if you have space, and I do. And it's just fun to find them, and they don't have the same issues as potted plants.
Mother Nature plants trees without the trauma we associate with like transplant shock and those types of things.
So then the opposite problem, though, is similar to what Kim had, was, well, now you have to put them in tubes or some way to protect them because the deer eat every freaking thing.
Except for Eastern Red Cedar.
Well, they actually do. If it's on their runway, they will, but generally not. Yeah.
Right.
So so then, even though you have a native tree and it's right there in a good location, I said, I want to grow this. Well, it won't be there, next year, right? It'll be eaten off over winter with the browse when the deer will come around. So it'll be there for only one season. I have many trees like that. So now you have to find some way to protect the tree. And I got leftover tubes and stuff like that. But a tube is also a terrible way for a tree to live. It has lots of its own issues. Many of these volunteers I find, I say, this is great. I look around and look up. Yeah, this is good. I get my old leftover tree tubes from other plantings, put a stake on there. A lot of times they still die. The tubes are maybe the best solution we have, but they, I don't know if it's light, heat, humidity, whatever. They don't transmit the right frequencies of light. They're not actually all that great.
We actually, the Maryland Forest Service, we've been accused of planting tube forest, not forest. And, but you're right, it's the deer issue. It's almost impossible really to grow a young tree in a field setting without that. If you remind me, Susan, I can share a research paper that the Maryland Forest Service did on the different tree tubes, what light they transmit, how much they transmit, which ones are better for young trees. It did a comparison of like 12 different types of tree tubes. I'd be happy to share that with the group.
I can send it out to everyone that registered for the meeting. And it's a good segue, and I'm sure we would be interested to talk to you about raising some trees, the species that you're interested in, and seeing how we can maybe get a tree program going to hand them out. We actually had started before COVID. I have a bunch of volunteers in my yard, and Dave was raising them. And so we were kind of just talking about doing that. So I'd love to talk to you more about that. And just for everyone else, Aqua is, many more of the people that are on this webinar. We have, lots of volunteers that get together to do invasive removal, trash cleanups. We did some tree maintenance on street trees, removing the stakes. For example, a little bit of pruning a couple of weeks ago. I know we can come to a property owner's home if they have a significant problem that needs a lot of volunteers. So reach out to us if you have some ideas of some projects. We're looking for some projects that we can do as a group. So please keep us in mind. So if no one has any other questions, I do want to ask Becky one more thing about the topping. I noticed in your bio, you mentioned about following up with violators of landscapers, I guess, that do that. What does a person have to do if they witness a tree, an arborist, supposedly a certified arborist? What would we do if we actually see that occur?
Okay, great question, and certainly, as my bio says, one I can easily answer. So licensed tree experts in the state are licensed by the Maryland Forest Service, and there is a complaint process available on our website. I'd be happy, again, Susan, if you want me to direct you to it, you can send it out to the group. Once you submit your complaint and any documentation you may have, license plates of trucks, or maybe you were able to snap a photograph, or whatever, you include that, you send it, and it gets investigated by us. And if it's a licensed company, we go through the Office of Administrative Hearing in Baltimore County. If it's unlicensed, we actually work with our natural resource police officers on those, and that can either be a fine or a trip to district court. So.
All right, great. And if you forward that to me, I'll send that along to everybody as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Becky. While we were finishing up our questions, I entered in my random number generator, and I got registrant number 9 for our door prize, and that is Alan Bear. So Alan, you are our winner of our tree tool. I will email you. You can either choose from a handsaw for your pruning, proper pruning, or a root knife. So I will get in touch with you, and we can coordinate that swap of the door prize. Thank you for attending.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is great. Very informative. Very informative.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out for our first virtual presentation. If you have other ideas for other presenters, please email me, and we'll do some other ones. Hopefully we'll do something face-to-face soon. Thank you again, Becky.
Thank you, Susan. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Becky.
Night.